There is a place in this world where the land ends and the water begins, and a man can stand at that exact seam for 30 years and learn that the sea is the most patient creature God ever made. I stood at that seam. They called it the sovereign stair, the broad gray flight of stone that drops from the sea gate of Castamere down to the lap of the Murith Sound, and for the better part of my life, I was the man who held the head of it. I am old now, and my knees remember more than my mind does, but I can tell you about one morning so clearly that I could walk you to the chip in the third step from the top, the one a careless deckhand made with a dropped capstan bar in a year before either of us was born. I knew every stone of that stair. I knew the tide that would cover the lowest 7 of them and the hour it would do it. And I knew, on the morning I am about to tell you, that a man can own 100 ships and 1,000 men and still understand nothing about the water at all. I was a sergeant of the KingsGuard of the Crown. That is a small and unfashionable distinction. The famous regiments stand at the palace gates inland, under the bearskins, in front of the cameras of every tourist who ever came to our country, and the songs are written about them. We at the sea gate were a quieter sort. We wore the same red wool, the same brass, the same tall black fur, the same white gloves that turned gray by noon if you let them touch anything. But we stood where the kingdom met the open water, and our duty was older than the songs. When a sovereign of Taro left his land or returned to it, he did so by water, down or up the sovereign stair, and we were the men who kept that stair clean of everything that did not belong on it. That was the whole of it. Keep the stair. Keep it for the one man it was built for. Let nothing and no one stand on it until he came. I had buried better men than myself in that work. Before the wool and the brass, I had served 11 years in the harbor patrol, in the gray launches that go out when the weather turns ugly, and everyone with sense is indoors. I had pulled men out of the Murith Sound who were not men anymore. Only the cold gray shape the sound makes of a man who underestimates it. I had learned out there in the launches, the one lesson the water teaches over and over until you finally hear it, which is that the sea does not hate you and does not love you and will not be hurried and will not be argued with. It keeps its own appointments. The tide comes in at the minute it was always going to come in, whether you are ready or whether you are drowning, and your shouting changes nothing. A man who learns that lesson young carries a certain stillness in him afterward. It is not coldness. It is only the knowledge that some things are coming whether you fret or not, and that your job is to be standing in the right place, doing the right thing when they arrive. That stillness is what they wanted at the sea gate, and that stillness is why they gave me the head of the stair on the morning the king came home to sign the accord. The accord, I should explain it, because the man I am going to tell you about had come to ruin it, though no one knew that yet, least of all him. The Murith Sound is a narrow water, a strait between our coast and the long low islands off it, and every ship that wants the short road to the eastern markets must pass through it. For a generation, the right to pilot and tax and govern those lanes had been a tangle, half hours and half claimed by foreign houses with deep pockets and longer memories, and the king had spent years quietly drawing it all back into the crown's hand. The Murith Accord was the knot tied at the end of that long thread. On the morning I am telling you of, the king was returning from a week at sea, from a review of the fleet that would patrol the Sound under the new compact, and he would land at the sovereign stair and walk up through the sea gate to a hall where the foreign houses would put their names beside his, and the matter would be settled for 100 years. It was, in its quiet way, one of the great mornings of the reign. The whole front of the harbor had been given over to it. There were stands of seating along the quay, draped in the crown's gray and silver. There was a band. There was a battery of the old saloon guns up on the mole, their crews already standing easy beside them in the early sun. And there were cameras, more cameras than I had ever seen at the sea gate, because for once the quiet old place at the edge of the water was the center of the country. I want you to see it the way I saw it that morning, because the seeing matters. The Murith Sound at first light is the flattest water you will ever look at, a sheet of beaten pewter with the islands lying low and dark on the far edge of it like the spines of sleeping animals. There was a wind getting up out of the east, the kind that does not look like much from the shore, but that I knew, in my patrol launch bones, would have teeth by mid-morning and would push a chop across the harbor mouth that a careless boat would not enjoy. The tide was on the make, climbing the stair stone by stone, and I had read the tables the night before the way I read them every working day of my life, so I knew the king's barge was timed to touch the stair at the top of the water, when the lowest dry step would be the 7th from the bottom, and the boat could be brought in smooth, and the king could step ashore onto a dry stone without a single drop touching the royal shoe. Everything in that morning had been timed to the water. The water does not care for kings, but the men who serve kings learn to care for the water, and so the whole great machine of the ceremony had been wound to the rhythm of the tide. That is the thing the rich man did not understand. He thought the morning revolved around arrivals, around grand entrances, around who stepped onto what stone in front of whose cameras. He did not understand that the morning revolved around the water, and that the water had already decided everything, hours before he woke. He came in on his yacht a little after 8. I had been at the head of the stair since before 6, and I would be there until the king had passed me and gone up through the gate, and in all those hours I would move perhaps 3 times, each movement a thing of inches, each one a part of the drill rather than a thing I chose. To stand a post like that is not nothing, whatever the idle think. The wool is heavy, and the sun finds you, and the fur on your head turns your skull into a slow oven, and your spine learns the exact place where it will ache, and then aches there for the rest of the watch. But that is the easy part. The hard part is the stillness of the mind. A man standing motionless for hours will hear every fool thought he owns come and knock at the door, and the discipline is not in the legs. It is in choosing, over and over all morning, to let the thoughts knock and not to answer. I had 30 years of practice at not answering. I was, that morning, very good at my work, and I say that not as a boast, but because it is the only way you will understand what happened. The man who came in on the yacht had been the best at his work too, in his way, for 30 years, and the two of us were about to find out whose work was the kind the morning would forgive. His yacht was a beautiful thing, and I will not pretend otherwise. She was long and white and low, with a hull that threw the morning light back at you in hard sheets, and she came up the harbor with the unhurried arrogance of a creature that has never in its life been told to wait. There was a banner at her masthead, a private device, gold on a dark ground, the mark of a house that had grown rich on the very shipping lanes the king had come to take back. I did not need to be told who she was. Half the harbor had been talking about him for a week. He was a magnate of the foreign houses, a man named Corwin Drayle, who owned more bottoms than some navvies and who had built that fortune in good part out of the Murrith lanes, out of the very tangle the Accord was about to undo. He had come, the talk went, to sign. He had come to put his great name beside the king's and accept the new order of things with as much grace as a man can manage, while 100 years of profit is quietly taken off his table. That was what he had come to do. I think now that he had decided, somewhere on the voyage in, that if he must lose the war he would at least not lose the morning, and that the way to keep the morning was to make it his. To arrive bigger than anyone. To stand, if he could, where the king would stand. I have had a long time to think about him, and I believe that is what was in his mind as the white yacht came up the harbor, that he meant to lose with such a display of size and confidence that the watching world would forget he had lost it all. There was only one berth he could have wanted, and it was the one he could not have. The sovereign stair has, at its foot, the single deepwater landing in all of Castermere Harbor where a great boat may come right up to the stone, and that landing is the king's. On any ordinary day a crown launch lies there, and on this day it had been warped clear and the water below my feet was kept open. A rectangle of empty deep water held against the one boat in the world that had the right to it. Every other vessel that morning, however grand, lay at the outer pontoons or rode at anchor in the roads and sent its great folk ashore in tenders to the lesser steps along the quay. Those were the rules of the place, older than any man alive, and they were not difficult rules, and they were posted, and the harbor master's people had told every captain of every yacht exactly where he might lie. They had told Drael's people too. I knew that, because I watched the launch go out to them at first light and I watched it come back, and I saw the set of the harbor master's shoulders when it returned, and a man learns to read shoulders. So Drael knew. Understand that before I tell you what he did. He knew the royal landing was forbidden to him. He had been told, plainly and in good time, by men whose whole business was the telling of it. He brought his white yacht up the harbor anyway and put her nose toward the empty deep water at the foot of my stair, as though the rule were a thing that applied to smaller men. I will say this for him. He had nerve. The yacht came in beautifully, her engines murmuring, her crew in white moving along the rail with the smoothness of a drilled thing, and she laid herself alongside the royal landing as neat as a hand laid flat on a table, and a man at her rail threw a line up the stone and another caught a fender, and in the space of a minute, the one boat that had no right to be there was made fast to the king's own landing as if she belonged. I heard behind me and above me on the quay the sound a crowd makes when it does not know whether it has seen a triumph or an outrage and is waiting to be told which. The harbor master was coming down the quay at a half run, which is the fastest a man in his position can decently move, and I could see the band's conductor looking about him for someone to tell him what to do, and up on the mole the gun crews had turned their heads. But none of that was mine. My post was the head of the stair. My duty was the stone under my own boots and the empty air above it, and so I did the only thing the drill allowed, which was nothing. I stood at the head of the sovereign stair, eyes forward over the water and the moored white yacht, and I waited because waiting was the work. Corwin Drael came up the stair to me himself. I had half expected he would send a man, the way his kind usually sends a man, but he came himself, and I understood why before he reached the top. He wanted to be seen doing it. There were cameras on the quay above, a great many of them, and a man does not arrange to moor his yacht at a king's landing in front of the world's cameras, and then send a servant to deal with the one obstacle. He climbed the gray stone in a coat that had cost more than I earned in a year, a glass of pale wine already in his hand though it was scarcely past 8, and a knot of his own people trailing him. And when he reached the top, he stopped a single pace in front of me and looked me over the way a man looks over a horse he is thinking of buying, and has already decided not to. "You," he said, "move." I did not move. I was not being defiant. There is a great deal of difference between defiance and discipline, though to a man like Drael they look the same, and the failure to tell them apart was the whole of his trouble that morning. Defiance is a thing you do at someone. Discipline is a thing you do regardless of anyone. I was not refusing him. I was simply keeping my post, the way I had kept it 10,000 mornings when there was no one on the stair at all, and the fact that he happened to be standing in front of it changed nothing about my duty. But he could not see that. He saw a man defying him, and men had not defied Corwin Drael in a very long time. "I don't think you heard me," he said, and he smiled, and it was a practiced smile. A smile that had closed 1,000 deals and broken 1,000 men who needed something from him. "I have a great deal of business with your king this morning, more business than you will do in your whole small life, and my boat is going to lie at this landing and you are going to stand somewhere else. I'll make it simple. Step aside and we'll all forget this. Or don't, and I'll have your name, and by this afternoon you'll be guarding a fish market." He let that sit. The crowd above had gone quiet enough that his voice carried up to them, which I am sure he intended. "I've ended bigger men than you over smaller things. Move." I have been asked in the years since what I was thinking while he said all this, and people are always disappointed by the answer, so I will give you the honest one and you may do with it what you like. I was thinking about the tide. Behind that face that did not move, I was running the table in my head the way I had run it 10,000 times, and I knew the water was 40 minutes from the top, give or take, and I knew the king's barge would be timed to that top, and I knew that whatever this man did in the next 40 minutes, the the water would not change its mind for him. I was thinking that he had made his boat fast in the one place where, in 40 minutes, every eye and every gun and every camera in the harbor would be pointed, because that is where the king would be, and that he had done it on purpose to be seen, without understanding what he had made certain he would be seen doing. I was thinking, in the old patrol launch part of me that never stopped reading water, that he was a man standing in a gully at low tide telling the sea that he was important. And I was thinking mostly that none of it was mine to solve. The harbor master would come. The colonel would come. The machine of the morning was already turning toward this, slow and certain as the tide. My part was the head of the stair, and so I kept the head of the stair and I let him talk. That was what undid him in the end, though neither of us knew it then. My stillness. He had come up the stair expecting one of two things, the way his kind always expect one of two things. Either I would yield and he would have his triumph, or I would bristle and argue and lay hands on him, and he would have his outrage, his story of the brute in the red coat who assaulted a distinguished foreign guest. He had a use for either. What he had no use for at all, what he had no answer to, was a man who would simply not be moved and would not be drawn, who would stand there in the heavy wool with the sweat coming down under the fur and look out over the water as if Corwin Drayle were no more to him than a gull on the railing. It enraged him. I could see it begin to enrage him, the smile going thin at the corners, and a man who studied faces for a living would have read it as a warning. Drayle did not study faces. He moved them or he ended them. He had never in his life had to study one. So he did the thing that men of his sort do when stillness defeats them. He tried to make me a thing he could move by making me feel small. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the wine, and he looked up at me because I had the better part of a head on him, and he said, lower now, just for me and the front rank of his people, and whatever cameras had the range, look at you. You know what you are. You're a decoration. A painted ornament they bolt to the gate so the tourists have something to photograph. You're not a soldier. You haven't fired a shot in anger in your life. You stand here in your costume and your little hat and you think the wool makes you a man. He shook his head slow, the way you shake your head at something not worth your contempt. I've built more in a year than your whole country will see in a century, and you're going to stand in my way. You, a harbor statue. And then, because the words had not moved me either, he threw the wine. He did it almost lazily, a flick of the wrist, the pale wine arcing out of the glass and across the front of my tunic in a long dark stain that ran down the red wool and dripped off the bottom hem onto the gray stone between us. It was a small thing and a calculated one. He could say, if it came to saying, that it was an accident, a clumsy guest, nothing more, and the cameras would not have caught the flick of the wrist, only the result. But we both knew what it was. It was a man testing whether I would break, paying for the test with a half glass of wine he could replace from a cellar of 10,000 bottles. Watching my face for the flinch. I gave him no flinch. The wine soaked cold through the wool to my chest, and I stood at the head of the stair and looked over the water, and the only thing that moved in all of me was a single drop running off my chin, which I let run, because to wipe it would have been to answer him, and I would not answer him. That should have been the end of it. A wiser man, a man who studied faces, would have understood in that moment that he had walked up against something he could not move and would have gone back down the stair and found another way to keep his morning. But Corwin Drayle was not wise that way, and I think the stillness had become, by then, a kind of madness in him. He had thrown wine on a man and the man had not moved, and rather than read that as the warning it was, he read it as weakness, as proof that the statue really was only a statue, and he reached out and did the worst thing he did all morning, the thing that, when the cameras were later studied frame by frame, made the whole world understand exactly what kind of man he was. He pulled off one white tan driving glove, slowly, finger by finger, and he reached up and struck me across the face with it. It was not a hard blow. A glove across the face never is. It is not meant to hurt the body. It is meant to hurt the man, to say to him and to everyone watching that he is so far beneath the striker that he may be slapped like a servant and is expected to take it. It is the oldest insult there is, older than the kingdom, and Drael chose it on purpose, because he wanted, in front of the cameras, to put a mark of contempt on the king's own guard, and watch the king's own guard do nothing about it. The leather caught me across the cheekbone and the corner of the eye. A sharp, small sting, and his people made a sound, half a laugh and half a gasp. And up on the quay, the crowd made the bigger sound, the outraged one, because the crowd, unlike Drael, could see what they were looking at. And I did nothing. I want to be very plain about that, because it is the heart of the thing. When the glove struck my face, every animal part of me, the part that was a young man in a patrol launch with his blood up, the part that had hauled drowned men out of the dark water with his own 2 hands, and knew exactly what a man's body could do when it was finally let loose. Every part of me that was not the discipline wanted to take that small, soft, cruel man by the front of his expensive coat and show him, very briefly, the difference between a decoration and a soldier. It would have taken me less than a second. It would have felt for that second like the most just thing in the world. And it would have given him exactly, precisely, completely what he came up the stair to get. He wanted the brute in the red coat. He wanted the assault. He wanted the story. The whole architecture of his morning, the moored yacht, the trailing cameras, the wine, the glove, the careful escalation. All of it had been built to produce the moment where the KingsGuard lost his temper and laid hands on a distinguished guest, so that Drael could be the wronged man, the victim, the dignified foreigner abused on Taro soil, and so turn his coming defeat at the signing table into a grievance the watching world would have to weigh against it. I did not give it to him. I stood at the head of the sovereign stair with his wine cold on my chest and the sting of his glove on my cheek and my eyes forward over the gray water, and I let the seconds go by, one and then another, until the not doing of it became its own kind of thunder. The crowd above had gone silent in a way crowds do not usually manage, a held silence, every one of them watching to see what the still man would do, and the still man did nothing, and the longer I did nothing the louder the nothing became, until it was the loudest thing in the harbor. Drael stood there with the glove still in his hand, and his triumph turning to ash in his mouth, because he had played his whole hand and the man would not break. And now the cameras had it, all of it, the wine and the glove and the contempt, and the only man in the frame behaving with any dignity at all was the one in the costume he had mocked. I think that was the moment he should have understood he had lost. I do not think he did. I think instead the madness took him fully, and he made the choice that destroyed him, which was to stop trying to move me and to simply go around me. "Fine," he said, the word came out tight. "Stand there then, be a statue. I have 100 years of business this country is about to steal from me, and I am not going to stand in the cheap seats while they do it. I'll take what's mine." And he turned from me and gestured to his people, the knot of them at the head of the stair, and he started down toward the landing where his yacht lay, and his people went with him, 2 of them carrying between them a tall folded thing I had not understood until that moment, which they now shook out and ran up onto a light staff they had brought ashore for the purpose. His banner, the gold device on the dark ground, the mark of his house. They meant to plant it on the sovereign's stair. They meant to stage his arrival there on the king's own stone, at the king's own landing with his own flag flying, so that when the world looked at the great morning it would see Corwin Drael standing at the heart of it, master of the moment, undefeated. Now I must tell you what I did, because it was the only thing I did all morning that I chose, and it has to be understood exactly. I did not stop him. I could not have stopped him without laying hands on him, and laying hands on him was the one gift I would not give. But the keeping of the king's stair allows the guard one thing beyond his stillness, one single permitted act, which is the challenge. The formal level warning, spoken once, that tells a man he is about to cross a line he must not cross and puts the crossing forever after on his own head and no one else's. It is not a threat. It is a record. It is the law of the place made audible so that no man can ever say he was not told. So when Corwin Drayle set his foot on the third step down, with his banner going up behind him and his people spreading out across the King's Landing, I turned my head, the first true movement I had made in 2 hours, and I spoke once, loud enough for him and for his people, and for the cameras, and for the silent crowd above to hear every word. "This is the sovereign's stair," I said. "It is kept for the king. No subject of any house may stand upon it when he comes. Stand back, sir. I will not tell you again." He laughed. He actually laughed, and he turned on the step and threw the laugh back up at me. "Or what?" he said. "You'll watch me very hard." And his people laughed too, the brittle laugh of men who laugh because the great man has, and he went on down the stair, and they planted his banner near the foot of it, on the king's stone, the gold device snapping out in the rising east wind, and Corwin Drayle arranged himself beneath it at the head of his own gangway, master of the King's Landing, and turned his face up toward the cameras to be admired. And I turned my head back to the front, and I held my post, and I said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say. I had told him. The record was made. What came next was not mine to deliver. What came next belonged to the water and the timetable and the great turning machine of the morning, all of which were already, in that moment, bringing the one thing toward the harbor mouth that would settle the whole matter without my lifting a hand. I knew where the barge was. That is the thing he did not know, the thing none of them knew, standing there preening on the stone. I had spent the whole confrontation half my mind on the man in front of me and the other half, the old launch hand half, on the water and the clock, and I knew that the King's barge had left the flagship at the appointed minute, and was even now coming up the sound on the top of the making tide, timed to the very stone it would touch, and that it would round the end of the mole and come into the sight of all Castermere at any moment. The whole of the great ceremony was wound to that arrival. The guns on the mole would speak. The band would play the salute. The regiment along the quay would present arms. The court and the draped stands would rise as one. And every eye, every lens, every soul in that harbor would turn, in a single instant, toward the sovereign's stair, toward the King's Landing, toward the one rectangle of stone the entire morning had been built to honor. Toward the place where Corwin Drayle now stood, beneath his own flag, in the King's place, with his back to the sea. I felt the wind come on a little harder out of the east. And I saw the first of the chops start to ruffle the pewter flat of the harbor, the chop I had known since dawn was coming, and I heard, far off and then less far, the change in the note of the water that a boat makes when she comes around a point with a tide under her. And then a man up on the mole, one of the lookouts, raised his arm and pointed, and the cry went down the line, quiet and electric, "Barge in sight." I did not turn to look. I did not need to. I had the whole of it in my head, the lines of it as clear as if I were watching, and I gave Drayle, in the privacy behind my unmoving face, the only mercy I had left to give him, which was a single silent count. "Come back up the stair now, sir, now in the next 10 seconds, and you will only be a man who made a scene, and the morning will close over you and forget. Come up now." He did not come up. He had his face to the cameras and his flag at his back and his triumph, as he thought it, in his hand, and he had no idea at all that the cameras were no longer his. The barge came around the end of the mole. I have stood at the head of that stair for the arrival of the King more times than I can number, and it never once failed to put a hand around my heart, and it did not fail that morning either, even with all the rest of it. She came on slow and stately on the top of the tide, the long gray launch with the crowned silver at her bow and the oars, for she was rowed in by hand for the last of it as the old custom demands, lifting and falling in a single time, and the wake of her spreading silver across the chop, and the King himself standing in the stern sheets in the gray of the sea service, a tall, straight figure with the morning behind him. And as her bow came clear of the mole, the whole machine of the morning came alive at once, the way it had been wound to. The first gun spoke from the mole, a great flat slam of sound that rolled across the harbor and came back off the warehouses, and then the second, and the band struck up the slow, grave march that is played for no one but the sovereign. And all down the quay, the regiment came to attention with a single crash of boots, and then presented arms in one long ripple of bright steel. And in the draped stands, the whole court of Taro rose to its feet as one body, and every face in all of Castamere, and every camera swung as one toward the sovereign's stair to behold the king come home. And there, beneath them all, at the foot of the king's own stair, in the king's own landing, with his own gold banner snapping in the east wind, stood Corwin Drayle. I wish I could tell you I watched his face in that moment, but my own duty took me then, and I am glad it did, because what I had to do was the cleanest thing in the morning, and I would not have wanted to miss it for the pleasure of his ruin. At the proper instant, on the proper note of the march, the head of the stair renders to the arriving sovereign the full present, the royal salute, the single grandest movement in all the drill, the one a guard of the sea gate may give to no one else in his life, and gives perhaps a dozen times in 30 years. I gave it. The 2 hours of stillness broke all at once into the one motion I had been keeping myself for, the snap of the heels, the rifle brought up, the whole body coming alive in a single disciplined crash of honor directed out over the water at the man in the stern of the barge. And the giving of it, you understand, framed the whole scene. The cameras following the king's barge found, in the same frame, the KingsGuard rendering the king's salute, immaculate, correct, devoted, and standing just below that guard, in the path of that salute, between the honor and the man it honored, the small, rich foreigner under his vulgar flag, caught in the act of standing where no subject of any house on earth may stand when the king of Taro comes home from the sea. He had wanted the cameras. He got the cameras. He got every camera in the harbor all at once, and not one of them was looking at his triumph. Every one of them was recording, in the same merciless frame, the king returning in dignity and the trespasser standing in his place, and there is no story a man can tell afterward, no amount of money in the world that can buy back a frame like that. I will tell you how it ended, the practical end of it, because the moral of a thing is only half of it and the other half is the doing. The king's barge does not, of course, simply run up onto a landing already occupied by a stranger and his flag. The moment the barge was sighted, the colonel of the KingsGuard, who had been coming down the quay through the whole of the latter part, gave the command that the drill provides for exactly such a thing, though I had never in 30 years heard it given in earnest, the order to clear the stair. And so, as the barge stood off the landing on her oars, holding her place on the tide while the guns rolled and the band played, a file of the KingsGuard came down the stone in slow ceremonial time, myself at the head of them, and we cleared the king's landing. We did it without a single hand laid in anger, which I have always been quietly proud of, because that too was the discipline, and the discipline was the whole point. We did not seize Drayle's people or strike his flag down or fling his banner in the water, though the harbor would have cheered to see it. We came down the stair in slow time, rank and bright and silent, and we took up our stations across the king's landing in the formal cordon, and the simple fact of the cordon, the wall of red and steel forming up in correct ceremonial order around the place his feet were standing, made it impossible for him to remain without doing violence to men who offered him none. His own people understood it before he did. They edged back, and they let his banner come down, folding it away as though it had never been raised, and one by one they retreated up the stair past the silent crowd, and at last Corwin Drayle himself, with no morning left to save and no triumph left to claim and every camera in the harbor on him, walked up the sovereign's stair and off it, past the very spot where he had thrown his wine and struck me with his glove, and at the top he was met, with perfect courtesy, by the harbor master and 2 of the colonel's men, who escorted him away to wherever such men are taken, and the king's landing was clean. And the barge came in. She touched the 7th step from the bottom at the very top of the water, exactly as she had been timed to, the lowest dry stone gleaming wet at its edge, and not one drop on the king's shoe. And the king of Taro came up the sovereign's stair as his line had come up it for 400 years, and I had the great honor of being the man at the head of it who held the salute as he passed, close enough to see his eyes, and I will tell you the truth that no one believes when I tell it. He never looked at the place where the foreigner had stood. He may have known. I am sure, afterward, he was told all of it. But in the moment of his coming home, he had eyes only for the stair and the gate and the kingdom waiting beyond it, and he went up past me into the sea gate to sign his accord, and the morning closed over the trespass as the tide closes over the stones, and it was as if the man had never been there at all. The accord was signed before noon. Corwin Drayle did not sign it. His house did in the end, weeks later in a smaller room on harder terms, because a man whose face has gone around the world standing in the king's place beneath his own flag has very little leverage left at any table. His concession over the Murrith lanes, the thing he had built his fortune on, the thing he had come to defend with his grand entrance, was withdrawn from him entirely. The lanes came back into the crown's hand-hole, as the king had always meant them to, and the new fleet sailed under the new compact, and the short road through the Sound was Taro's road from that day on. And his name, which had stood for 2 generations on the great brass plate of the harbor charter among the houses granted the freedom of Castamere, was struck from it. I saw the plate after they had done it. There is a smooth blank place where his name was, and the new lettering of the houses that came after has been set around it, so that the blank place remains, and will remain, a small bright absence on the brass for anyone who knows to look, which is its own kind of monument to the morning. They asked me afterward, the colonel and 1 or 2 others, why I had not simply stopped him sooner, why I had let it go as far as the wine and the glove and the planting of the flag when a sharp word or a turned shoulder early on might have spared the morning its scene. And the honest answer, the one I gave them, is the one I have been circling all this while, and it is the only thing I really have to tell you, the rest being only the story it hangs on. I did not stop him because he could not be stopped, only delayed, and a thing only delayed always comes due at the worst possible hour, which on that morning would have been the king's own. And I did not break for him because breaking was the one thing he had come for, and the one thing it was my whole duty to deny him. But mostly I did not move because I have spent my life at the seam where the land ends and the water begins, and the water taught me the lesson young, in the gray launches, with the cold dead weight of careless men in my arms, that the sea does not need to chase the man who insults it. It does not argue, and it does not hurry, and it does not raise its voice. It simply keeps its appointment, and the man who stood in the gully telling it how important he was is still standing there when it arrives. My whole part that morning was to be a stone in the seam and to hold while the tide came in. The man wanted me to be a soldier so that he could be a victim, and I would not be made a soldier. The man wanted me to be a statue so that he could be a king, and I would not be made a statue either. I was a guard of the sea gate. My duty was to keep the stair and to wait for the water, and the water, as it has done since before there were kings or flags or rich men to plant them, kept its own appointment and carried him out with the rest of the day's rack, and I never had to lift a hand. I am old now, as I said. I do not stand the stair anymore. Younger men with better knees keep it and keep it well, and the king who comes up it is not the king who came up it that morning, the way of the world being what it is. But I go down to the sea gate still, on the bright hard mornings when the wind is getting up out of the east, and I sit a while and watch the tide climb the gray stones, the 7th, the 6th, the 5th, the way I read it 10,000 times, and I think about the difference between the men who learn the lesson of the water and the men who do not, and I think it is very nearly the whole of what I know. There will always be a Corwin Drayle. There will always be a man who owns 100 ships and mistakes the stillness of a disciplined man for the emptiness of a small one, who throws his wine and strikes his blow and plants his flag where it must not stand, certain that size and noise and the world's cameras can hold back the thing that is coming for him. And there will, I hope, always be a man in a heavy red coat standing at the seam, sweating under the fur, who knows the tide table by heart and has buried enough careless men to have lost his taste for hurrying anything, and who understands that the strongest thing a man can do on a morning like that is to keep his post and keep his word and keep his hands still and let the water come in. It always does. It always comes in at the minute it was always going to. The only question the morning ever really asks of a man is whether he will be standing in the right place, doing the right thing when it arrives. That is the whole of the story, and it is enough.